Hi everyone, today we're going to paint some pears. Pears are relatively easy. They're basically circular shapes with a somewhat triangular shape on top, and for beginners they're pretty easy to paint. So I've got my image sketched out on my mixed media 500 series board. I like to start with the shadow side of my subject matter. I never start out with my light side, so I'm starting out with a burnt sienna color. I can always lighten that up as I go along, but I like to start out with my darker side rather than my lighter side. So I'm just knocking that in very quickly with my 2-inch brush. Adding a little bit of color. There's no reason to keep the hue all the same with one flat color, otherwise your paintings might look a little flat. So sometimes I like to dip in and pick some other colors up with my brush, just to give it a little bit of flavor and some visual interest. You can see I'm working wet on wet here. I had laid down the burnt sienna and then dipped my brush into some ochre and then put that right in the wet paint. So now I'm going in on the lighter side, and I like to work from dark to light. That burnt sienna paint is still wet, so it's blending nicely within that passage. So working wet on wet also gives it somewhat of a painterly look, so that you don't have sharp edges. Acrylics are somewhat known for having hard edges because the paint dries so quickly that you rarely get a chance to blend. But when you work wet and wet, which means you paint a passage and immediately you paint something else in it, you're basically painting wet paint into wet paint, and that's a way of getting softer edges. I try to keep away from a coloring book look, so I do try to soften some of the edges, which I'm doing in between the lighter ochre and the darker burnt sienna. And I'm hitting the left pear with a lighter tone. So I'm going even lighter now, because that's where the light would be hitting the pear the strongest. So you can see I have some fairly sharp edges there, and I'm going to go in and soften them because the paint is still wet. So I have an intermediate tone in between the lightest part of the pear, which is a light yellow, and the darkest part, which is burnt sienna with a little bit of ultramarine mixed in with it, just to give it some depth. Now I've got a little bit of green gold on my brush. And again, I'm softening those edges because I don't want it to have that sharp coloring book look. And the only reason I can do this is because the paint is thick and it's still wet. If the paint were dried already, I'd be getting much harsher edges. So I'm adding a little bit of green here. It gives it a little bit of visual interest, and it complements the red and the warm brown tones nicely. There's my stem. Now I'll put in another stem. And stem number 3. So even though it may seem like a small detail, stems have volume too. So they will reflect lighter where the light is hitting the stem more directly. So one of the things I always do is I put a light effect on my stem. Now I'm going in with a darker shadow underneath the pears. One of the things you may want to keep in mind about acrylics is that they do dry a couple of shades darker. So especially with your dark tones, make sure that you don't go too dark. Plan ahead a little bit. Otherwise, if you go as dark as you want and it's very dark, you may end up with a black passage. And this is because the binder in acrylics is milky colored when it's wet and it dries clear. So while you're looking at wet paint, you're actually looking at the color of the pigment mixed in with a little bit of that whitish, milky colored binder. But since it's going to dry clear, you are going to be left with a passage that doesn't have any of that milky color in it, so it will be drying darker. So whenever I'm making my shadows, I always make sure that I don't go too dark. So now I'm going to go in with my background. I've probably said it in the other videos, but I like to put my background in after I've painted my subject. It just helps me to feel like I've done the most important work first, and now I'm carving it around my subject matter. And I'm also fixing some of the drawing. If I got some of the drawing wrong, if the proportions were off or wasn't really perfectly correct, I can go in and fix it. I can cut in a little bit closer. Now I'm going in on the right side of the pear, and I always have to make sure that I don't cut in too closely. I'm softening an edge there with my fingers. Finishing up some of the background color. And I did cut in a little bit close there. So I'm going in and I'm reinstating some of that shadow area. The shadow next to the object is a little bit darker than when it spreads out further away. So I'm making that area that's close to the subject a little bit darker. And I'm going in with a very dark background. Again, I have to remember that this is going to dry darker than what I see while it's wet. So I have to make sure that it doesn't go black. So I'm not sure how it will appear on the video, but it's a little bit lighter than how I expect it to dry. Pears are pretty forgiving because they're very lumpy and bumpy, and they've got so many different shapes. I think I've heard that there's something like 30 different types of pears. So they're a good subject for beginning painters. You can take a lot of leeway with them. Just cutting in and revising some of the shapes, some of the drawing. So notice how I dragged my brush over the white part of the background, and I did it fairly delicately because I'm just trying to create a softer edge. And that's a 1-inch brush I'm using now to put the stems in. There's a very, very slight shadow that's caused by the light hitting the left side of the pear, and I'm trying to put that in right now. All these little nuances create the sense of structure in whatever it is you're painting. So even though they may seem like very small details, they do communicate the three-dimensionality of the piece. So in that sense, they're really not unimportant. Anything that communicates different planes on a subject is something that you may want to consider showing how it has a light effect on it. I usually save my lightest lights for the end. So you can see I'm going in with a very light yellow. And that's about it. There's the pears, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you do this week.